My father mocked my wedding, erased my name. I exposed his stolen valor and reclaimed mine. When my father raised his glass at my wedding, I thought, just for a second, that he might finally be proud of me. Instead, he smiled and said, "She's wearing the wrong uniform. She'll never belong to my Air Force." The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It was worse, soft, embarrassed, like pity disguised as politeness. I remember the weight of the silence after it, the kind that wraps around your throat and tells you to sit down, to shrink. But I didn't. My name is Petronella Vaughn, and that day, standing in my white dress uniform, I learned something my father never did. You don't need a man's permission to stand tall. The sound of his glass tapping was sharper than any gunshot I'd ever heard. It cut through the laughter, through the music, through every quiet hope I'd buried beneath the uniform I wore. The afternoon sun spilled through the chapel windows, turning the desert dust into gold. For a moment it almost felt holy, until his voice broke it apart. He'd arrived late, of course, the legend, the man everyone stood for. His medals caught the light, gleaming like proof that God had favorites. When he rose to speak, every conversation died mid-breath. He smiled, not warm, but thin, surgical, and delivered a sentence that carved something out of me so cleanly I didn't bleed right away. The room froze. You could hear the faint buzz of the lights, the wind pressing against the glass. I felt everyone's eyes slide toward me, waiting for me to crumble, to swallow humiliation like a duty. But I didn't move. Then, from the back of the room, a chair scraped. One of my former cadets stood, straightened, and saluted. The sound of his heels hitting the floor echoed like a command. Another followed, then another, until rows of uniforms formed a wall of quiet defiance. He stayed seated, rigid, stone-faced. I looked at him once, long enough to see the flicker of something he couldn't hide. Maybe anger, maybe shame, maybe the first crack in a monument. "Let's finish the ceremony," I said softly. The salute said what words couldn't. I belonged. Roswell is a town built on silence, and I was raised fluent in it. Every street smelled like gasoline and dust. Every porch had a flag that never came down. Kids there were born with uniforms waiting for them, with fathers whose medals told their stories. I had neither. My mother, Nora, wore her calm like armor. She stitched uniforms for other soldiers and never once complained that mine would come without a name. She'd smile and tell me, "The world will find reasons to shame you. Don't help it do the job." I didn't understand then how much truth a mother can hide behind softness. He visited sometimes. The officer people saluted before they even saw his face. He'd pat my shoulder, call me kid, then leave before dark. Everyone in town whispered what I already knew. I was a secret dressed like a person. At 19, I buried my mother alone. The service was quiet. No honor guards, no folded flag, just wind across the sand. A week later, a single wreath arrived with a note, "Find another name to ruin." I did. I joined the Air Force not to follow him, but to prove I could fly without his wings. I chose my mother's name instead. Soft on the inside, steel on the surface. 3 years later, I stepped into a command tent in the middle of Haiti's shattered capital and froze. Behind the operations map stood the man I'd spent my life trying not to resemble. He looked older, sharper, untouchable. He didn't flinch when our eyes met. He just said, "Lieutenant V, we worked side by side for 3 weeks. He gave orders like tests, short, cold, impossible to question. I carried them out without hesitation, pretending the voice through my headset wasn't the same one that once told me not to ruin his name." One night, rain hammered the camp while I crawled through debris to pull civilians from a collapsed clinic. By morning, my uniform was shredded and my hands were shaking. The after-action report landed on his desk before sunrise. He crossed out my name and replaced it with 2 words, "Team effort." No glance, no acknowledgement, just an eraser, clean as a scalpel. At the final debrief, he said, "Some soldiers carry names they didn't earn." I saluted him. He didn't return it. A week later, a letter appeared in my locker. No signature, no rank, only one line, he knew. "You just couldn't risk being your father twice." Maybe he wasn't heartless. Maybe he was terrified of losing the only thing he'd ever truly worshipped, perfection. It took one newspaper headline to turn my silence into his weapon. 10 years after Haiti, I had earned my promotion, a new rank, a new class to teach at the academy, leadership, integrity, all the words he used to brand his name. Then the article appeared, "Daughter of General Vaughn follows her father's legacy." Legacy. The word burned like static. I had never carried his name, but somehow I was still trapped beneath it. The phone rang hours later. His voice came through like frost on steel. "You used my name without permission." I replied, "I used your silence, sir. It's louder." He hung up. A week later, a sealed letter landed on my desk. Temporary suspension, subject to review of misrepresented family affiliation. The signature at the bottom belonged to a man who once served under him. At the hearing, Colonel Richard Price, my mother's old friend, waited for me in the hallway. His hair had gone gray, but his eyes held something heavy. "Jasper made sure your name never appeared next to his," he said quietly. "He erased you the day you were born." I didn't answer. I just felt the air leave my lungs. To be forgotten by blood is one thing, to be deleted by design is another. That night, I opened my mother's cedar box. Inside, wrapped in yellowed paper, was a photograph. My mother beside a man in uniform. Henry Vaughn, my uncle, my father's younger brother. On the back, written in her soft cursive, it said, "He saved him once. The world never knew." I stared at it until my vision blurred. The medal my father wore every Veterans Day, the Distinguished Service Cross, belonged to Henry, the man who died saving him. He taught me that honor meant never bending. I was about to teach him it meant standing alone. The next morning I started digging. In the archives, the air smelled of dust and toner, a graveyard for forgotten truths. I found the mission file from 1983, Major Henry Vaughn, missing in action. The handwriting that amended the report was unmistakable. His, precise and heavy. He hadn't lost his brother. He'd buried him in paperwork. I filed a formal request to restore Henry's honors. I knew it would destroy the man the world worshipped, but there's no redemption in silence. By the end of the week, whispers filled the corridors. A retired officer stopped me near the elevators. "You don't tear down a monument just to fix its foundation," he said. I looked him straight in the eye. "You do if it's built on someone's grave." That night, an anonymous email flashed across my screen. "You're making a mistake. He'll destroy you the way he destroyed your mother." I traced the source. A Pentagon server, my half-brother, his golden son. We met at a military cafe off base, both in plain clothes. "You're chasing ghosts," he said. "Dad built a legacy for all of us. Don't burn it just because you weren't invited." I replied, "I'm not burning it. I'm removing the ashes." Later at home, I opened another envelope, handwritten, the ink faded. It was from my mother, forwarded by Richard Price. "If you ever have to choose between peace and truth, remember peace built on a lie is just silence wearing medals." I cried for the first time in years, not for what she endured, but for what she accepted. I understood then that silence had its own inheritance, and I was done passing it down. The quiet after a scandal is louder than any applause. In the weeks following my report, my name became the line that split every hallway in two. Some called me brave. Others whispered words sharper than bullets: traitor, opportunist, ungrateful child. I didn't respond. I'd learned long ago that silence can be both a prison and a weapon. At night, Colorado Springs turned cold. In our small apartment, Caleb would read at the table while I stared at the window, watching the mountains disappear into fog. He'd say, "You don't need to fight his war anymore." I'd answer, "It's not his war. It's the one he left unfinished. Our wedding was weeks away." I couldn't tell if I was marrying out of love or to prove I could build something that didn't carry his name. Then one afternoon, a brown envelope arrived, stamped from Veterans Affairs, Santa Fe. Inside, one sentence written in a shaky hand: "You're still not one of us." Signed, Jasper Vaughn. I laughed, dry, soundless. Caleb saw the letter and asked, "Are you going to reply?" "No need," I said. "Silence runs in the family." Later, I noticed the ink smudges where the hand had trembled. Left-handed, he'd had a stroke. Even when he hated me, I was still in his mind. Ibrica days later, our lawyer called. My father had transferred everything: medals, accounts, property, to his legitimate son and officially listed me as an estranged relative. The inheritance of his silence was complete. I should have felt anger. Instead, I felt light. You can't lose what was never yours. I mailed the wedding invitation to the veteran's home anyway. I didn't expect him to come. It wasn't an olive branch, it was a seat he could fill or leave empty, but one that said, "You're still welcome in the room you tried to erase me from." Even rejection, when written in trembling ink, feels almost like love. The chapel sat at the edge of the New Mexico desert, white walls glowing under the afternoon sun, flags fluttering in a wind that smelled like dust and memory. Guests filled the pews, half civilians, half uniforms, two worlds that had never shared the same roof before. I wore white, not lace, not silk, but my service uniform. Caleb smiled, brushing my sleeve. "You look like peace itself." "More like a ceasefire," I said. When the doors opened and the murmur fell, I saw him arriving late again, my father in a dark suit heavy with medals, leaning on a cane, guided by a nurse. He sat in the front row, posture perfect, expression unreadable. The ceremony moved like air before a storm, quiet, taut, too still. Then came the toasts. He rose. The medals on his chest caught the light, and with a faint smile he said, "She's wearing the wrong uniform. She'll never belong to my Air Force." The room froze. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. I felt Caleb shift beside me. I placed a hand on his arm, a quiet command to stay. From the far right, a chair scraped. Sergeant Kim, one of my cadets, the first black woman to graduate top of her class, stood and saluted. The sound of her heels striking the floor cracked the silence. Then Captain Sloan rose behind her. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the hall was a sea of uniforms, a forest of raised hands, silver pins gleaming beneath the desert light. He didn't move. He sat there, stone still, as if the salute itself were treason. I looked at him, my voice barely above a breath. "Your army is still here, Dad. You just stood on the wrong side of it." Somewhere in the back I saw a camera's red light blinking. Ellen Rodriguez, the war correspondent, capturing every second. That night, her video would go viral. The image of a man seated in silence while the entire Air Force stood to honor the daughter he disowned. They'd call it the salute heard across the Air Force. 3 days after the wedding, the world caught fire. The video, the salute heard across the Air Force, spread across every screen in America. Some called it a moment of courage, a woman reclaiming honor in a room that tried to break her. Others called it treason, a daughter humiliating a national hero. The noise was deafening, but I didn't add my voice to it. Then came the investigation. The Department of Defense reopened the old files, the ones buried so deep I'd almost stopped believing they'd ever see daylight again. The truth was simple and brutal. The medal my father wore, the one etched into every photograph of him, belonged to his brother, Major Henry Vaughn, the man who died saving him. When the report was released, headlines turned cold. The same papers that once praised the Iron General of Kirtland now wrote about stolen valor, falsified commendations, a legacy built on a grave. My father was stripped of his titles. His name vanished from the Hall of Honor. Mine appeared on the reinstatement orders the next morning. They invited me to Washington to speak at the Leadership and Valor ceremony. I drafted a speech about truth and legacy, but I never read it. The night before the event, the phone rang. General Vaughn had another stroke. A woman said he kept asking for someone named Lieutenant V. Not daughter, not Petronella, Lieutenant V, the only version of me he'd ever allowed himself to acknowledge. By dawn, I was on a flight to Santa Fe. The hospital room was quiet, humming with the soft rhythm of machines. He looked smaller than I remembered, the great weight of his medals replaced by wires and tubes. His eyes fluttered open when I stepped closer. "You stood," he whispered, each word fractured by breath. When I couldn't, I took his hand, bones sharp beneath paper skin. "I learned it from watching you, what not to do." For a second, something human broke through the years of armor. He smiled, a fragile, uneven thing, but real, the kind that costs pride to make room for truth. We didn't talk after that. There was nothing left to defend, no ranks, no bloodlines, just two soldiers who finally stopped fighting. When I left the room, a nurse was changing his fourth. She paused and said softly, "He cried after you walked out. First time we've seen that." On the table beside his bed sat my wedding photo, framed neatly next to a medal. The Distinguished Service Cross, its ribbon faded but clean. He'd kept it all this time, waiting for the war between us to end. The ceremony was held beneath the wide Colorado sky, the mountains standing like quiet witnesses behind the Air Force Academy. Rows of uniforms filled the hall, veterans with silver hair, cadets barely out of youth, officers who had once served under his command. It wasn't a celebration. It was a correction written in the language of respect. I didn't wear my dress blues that day, just a white shirt, the insignia pinned to my chest, nothing more. When my name was called, I stepped to the podium. The lights felt warmer than usual, almost merciful. Some legacies are borrowed, I said, my voice steady, carrying through the stillness. Some are earned. Today we return what was never ours to keep. I placed the medal, its ribbon faded, its surface still gleaming, into the glass case prepared for it. The sound of it settling echoed through the room like a closing door. Then, without a word, every person in uniform rose to their feet and saluted. Hundreds of hands lifted in unison. The silence that followed wasn't absence, it was reverence. In the front row, he sat in his wheelchair, frail now, the weight of his body finally catching up to the weight of his name. He didn't look at me. His eyes stayed locked on the medal. When the crowd lowered their hands, a single tear slid down his cheek, catching the light like a confession. After the ceremony, he asked to see me alone. The room they wheeled him into was small, sunlight filtering through half-closed blinds. He gestured for me to sit for a moment. I thought he might apologize. Instead, in a voice barely more than breath, he said, "For honor to live, ego must die." Then he pulled out a form, already half-signed, his own request to surrender every remaining title, every military pension. His hand shook violently, the pen slipping between his fingers. I reached forward, steadied it with my own, and guided the stroke across the page. The signature wavered, uneven and human, but the seal beneath it stamped red and absolute. When I stood to leave, his voice followed, thin but sure, "Tell them I died standing tall." I turned back, managed a small smile. "You already did." A year later, I walked back through the glass doors of the academy, the air sharp and clean before morning formation. The cadets still marched in perfect lines, but now their salutes came toward me. I'd become head instructor for leadership and integrity, words that once felt like a battlefield, now just lessons to pass on. 2 cups of coffee always sat on my desk. One was Colonel Black, strong, bitter, no sugar, the other 2 sugars. A cadet finally asked, half smiling, "Ma'am, why 2 cups?" "Because leadership isn't about one flavor," I said. "It's knowing what bitterness costs." When the lecture ended, silence lingered, the kind that means they've heard something they'll remember. I looked at them, bright faces, untested hearts, and said, "You salute with what you have. Sometimes all you have is forgiveness." That evening, sunlight poured through the window, striking the framed wedding photo where rows of uniforms still stood mid-salute. On the table sat an envelope, edges yellowed, stamped from the VA hospital. Inside, written in a trembling hand, were the words, "If honor has a face, I've seen it. It looked like yours." Signed, Jasper Vaughn. I folded the note, set it beside Colonel Black, and whispered, "Guess we both finally stood tall." Outside, the wind lifted the flag. It rose slow and steady, and in that soft rustle, I could almost hear a final salute from a left hand somewhere beyond the horizon. The desert wind still carries his voice some nights, sharp as a blade but brittle now, like glass ready to shatter. I stand at the edge of the academy grounds, where the Colorado sky stretches wide enough to hold every wound I've ever carried. The weight of my father's words at my wedding, "She'll never belong to my Air Force," sits differently now. It used to feel like a verdict, a door slammed shut. But as I trace the arc of my life, from Roswell's dust to the salutes that rose for me, I realize it was never his Air Force to gatekeep. It was mine. It was ours. I think of my mother most often at dusk, when the light softens and the world feels forgiving. She taught me that silence could be armor, but I learned it could also be a cage. When I buried her, I thought I'd buried my chance to belong, to be more than a secret etched in someone else's shadow. Yet her words, "The world will find reasons to shame you. Don't help it do the job," became my compass. They guided me through Haiti's ruins, through the sting of my father's eraser, through the moment I stood in a chapel and felt a room full of salutes rebuild what he tried to break. That day, I didn't just reclaim my name, I reclaimed the right to define it. There's a strange peace in forgiving someone who never asked for it. When I held his trembling hand in that hospital room, guiding his pen to sign away his titles, I didn't feel victory, I felt release. His confession, that single tear at the ceremony, wasn't just his, it was mine, too. For years, I'd carried his rejection like a wound I didn't deserve, but in that moment, I saw it for what it was, his fear, not my failure. He'd built a monument to himself, but it was hollow, propped up by a brother's sacrifice and a daughter's silence. Helping him let it go wasn't weakness, it was the strongest thing I've ever done. Now, standing before cadets who look at me with untested hope, I feel the weight of what I've earned. Not just the insignia on my chest, but the clarity that comes from choosing truth over peace. I teach them that leadership isn't about being unbreakable, it's about knowing what to carry and what to set down. Every morning, I place 2 cups of coffee on my desk, one bitter, one sweet, because life demands you taste both. My father's last note, tucked beside that wedding photo, feels like a salute of its own. If honor has a face, I've seen it, it looked like yours. Those words don't erase the years of silence, but they remind me that even broken things can reflect light. I'm not fighting his war anymore. The flag outside my window rises each morning, steady as a promise, and I salute it not for him, but for the woman I became despite him. For my mother, who stitched courage into every seam. For Henry, whose medal now rests where it belongs. And for every cadet who'll learn that honor isn't borrowed. It's built, one defiant step at a time.